What you see on the news is not new at all. It is the echo of words written long before nations drew borders or soldiers lifted weapons. For in the records of the Spirit, the conflict that now erupts between Israel and Iran was already inscribed. I look into that hidden stream and I see not merely politics or armies, but the unfolding of a plan that stretches from the desert nights of Abraham to the crowded streets of today. The world believes it is watching a modern war, but what is modern when the blueprint was laid in eternity? Long before rockets pierced the skies, the heavens declared the end from the beginning, and what men call chaos has been seen in the light of prophecy. As I gaze into this vision, I hear the voices of rulers and generals, but behind them is another sound, the resonance of Scripture vibrating through time, whispering that this battle is not the invention of governments, but the continuation of a covenant. Do you think the struggles of our age are born only of ideologies and weapons, of oil and borders, of treaties broken and alliances made? Look deeper, and you will see that beneath the surface of every headline there is something far older, far deeper, something spiritual. In the silence of prayer, I saw two currents colliding, the visible one of men who build strategies, and the invisible one of forces that shape nations according to patterns set centuries ago. When you lift your eyes beyond the surface, the hostility between these peoples is no longer just about land. It is the echo of a divine design. It is written that kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall. Yet behind their rise and fall stands a hand unseen. I have walked through the records of the soul and found that this conflict is not an accident of politics. It is part of a blueprint woven into the very fabric of history. The names change, the leaders change, but the current remains. Israel and Iran are not simply two nations facing off with weapons. They are symbols of promises made and resisted, of light contending with shadow. This story is not the tale of two governments. It is prophecy in motion. The question is not whether men will negotiate peace or declare war. The question is how the ancient words will unfold. You ask, how will it end? But the end has already been whispered. It lies not in the treaties of parliaments, but in the decrees of heaven. I say to you, watch carefully, for every move on the ground reflects a script already written above. As I open these records, I feel the weight of destiny. I sense the currents of time pressing toward fulfillment. What seems like a new war is but the resurfacing of an old division, a fracture born in the household of Abraham that has echoed through deserts and empires and now resurfaces in missiles and speeches. The first chapter was written under the stars of Canaan, and what you see today is another page being turned. I tell you, the war that rages in news reports is the surface shadow of a spiritual confrontation that has never ended. And it is not simply about nations. It is about covenant, about the struggle between what is promised and what resists the promise. As I look closer, I see the faces of those who suffer, and I also see the greater purpose beyond their pain. For no event of history is without its place in the eternal design. There is order hidden in what looks like disorder. There is prophecy hidden in what looks like chance. If you have eyes to see, recognize that what unfolds today was spoken long ago, and the invitation is not to fear but to discern. For the one who perceives the signs understands that the story is larger than politics, larger than generals, larger than nations. It is the story of the divine weaving itself through time, calling humanity to lift its vision beyond the smoke of war. That is where I begin, at the threshold where the visible ends and the invisible takes over, where Israel and Iran are not merely enemies but actors in a sacred script, a drama whose conclusion has already been declared in the heavens. Abraham stood beneath the desert sky with a promise burning in his soul. And from that promise, two sons emerged, each carrying a line of destiny that would shape the course of nations. Isaac, born of the covenant, and Ishmael, born of human decision, yet blessed in his own right. I have seen in the records of the Spirit how this moment split the river of history into two streams, one flowing with the sacred covenant, the other flowing with strength and multitude, and together these streams would one day crash against one another like fire against oil. In Genesis, it is written that to Abraham's seed the land was given, yet even before Isaac drew his first breath, Ishmael had already been born through Hagar, and the tension of the father's heart was not just between two children, but between two destinies. Can you imagine standing as Abraham did, looking upon two boys of your own blood, one carrying the divine covenant and the other carrying the blessing of multiplication, and knowing that both were loved by God, yet separated by a mystery deeper than choice? In Genesis 17, the Lord declared that Ishmael would be blessed, that 12 princes would rise from him, but the covenant would pass through Isaac, and here is the divine divide. Not a rejection, but a separation of purpose. Ishmael would become the father of great tribes, his descendants stretching across deserts, forming the backbone of the Arab peoples, fierce and enduring, while Isaac would father Jacob, who was renamed Israel, the bearer of the covenant, the one entrusted with carrying the light into history. This is not a story of favoritism. It is a prophecy in motion, a division marked not by human prejudice, but by divine design. Have you ever wondered why the struggle between Israel and the Arab world feels so unending? Why it carries a weight heavier than politics? Why it feels as if the very soil cries out with the memory of division? It is because this conflict was conceived in the womb of history itself, in the tent of Abraham. In the night of promises whispered under the stars, the world looks upon wars and treaties and sees power games, but I tell you, what you see is only the shadow of this ancient fracture, the covenant through Isaac and the blessing through Ishmael, both real but enduring, both pressing their influence into every generation. As I look into these records, I see the sorrow of Abraham, for no father delights in division. Yet the hand of God was marking history with precision. Ishmael's line would give rise to multitudes, to peoples of deserts and cities, to a faith that would later sweep across continents, while Isaac's line would carry the covenant into 12 tribes that would wrestle with angels and receive the law on Sinai. Do you see now why the conflict is not just about borders or armies? It is about legacy. It is about a spiritual inheritance that cannot be erased. If your own family carried such a divide, if one child bore the covenant and the other bore the blessing, could you bear to look upon them and know they would one day stand opposed, not by choice, but by destiny? This is why the battle of today is not new. It is the continuation of a story written in Abraham's household. When the nations rage, when alliances form, they are echoing the cries of two sons growing in the desert, one under the covenant, the other under the blessing. And yet God was present in both. For Ishmael was not cast away. He was heard. He was cherished. He was promised greatness. The divine split is not cruelty. It is design, a pattern set, so that prophecy might unfold. As I watch history move, I see how the descendants of Ishmael carried strength, resilience, and faith, while the descendants of Isaac carried law, covenant, and the prophetic line that would lead to Christ. Two currents, two forces, neither meaningless, both essential to the great unfolding drama. The question I ask you now is this: when you look at your own life, do you only see the surface of conflicts, or can you discern the deeper design, the way blessings and covenants move in hidden patterns shaping outcomes? long before you understand them. For just as Abraham's house carried a divine divide, so too does every soul carry within it tensions between promise and desire, between waiting on divine timing and grasping with human hands. And what you see in nations is but a mirror of what stirs in individuals. This is the mystery revealed in the story of Abraham, that what begins in one tent can echo through millennia, and what begins in one heart can ripple across generations. The war you watch is not born of today. It is the child of that ancient night, and the destiny of two sons still speaks through the cries of nations. After the flood, when the waters withdrew and the earth was cleansed, three sons stepped out with Noah into a world washed new, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, each carrying within them the seeds of nations yet unborn. In the quiet unfolding of their lines, one name appears only briefly yet, carries a weight that echoes through history. Madai, the son of Japheth, though mentioned without detail in Genesis 10, his descendants would merge with a people destined to shape empires and prophecy alike. The Medes, from Japheth came the Medes, and when they joined with the Persians, a kingdom of iron and silver arose, a power so vast it would shatter Babylon itself and etch its name into the visions of Daniel. This alliance of Medes and Persians was not an accident of geography or coincidence of bloodlines. It was a convergence foreseen in the structure of prophecy. The Medo-Persian Empire emerged not only as a political power, but as an instrument through which divine purposes were revealed. In the records of the Spirit, I see how the rise of Persia was already foreshadowed, the shoulders of a giant that would bear the weight of empires and the burden of prophecy. This was not merely the story of kings, but of destinies hidden in genealogies. Madai's brief mention is like a single stone dropped in a river, yet its ripples extend across centuries until they touch the land. We call today Iran. The Persians, fierce and disciplined, became a force that history could not ignore, but prophecy had already marked them. When Daniel spoke of kingdoms of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, he was not imagining empires. He was discerning patterns of divine orchestration. The Medo-Persian realm was the chest and arms of silver, a power that would both crush and liberate, that would stand in judgment against Babylon, yet also serve as a vessel of restoration for Israel. In this paradox lies the key to Persia's role, at times the adversary, at times the ally, yet always present in the script written above. Consider how remarkable it is that a single descendant of Japheth could carry in his line the future of an empire that would contend with Israel across ages. The line of Madai merged with Persia, and out of that union rose Cyrus, the king named by Isaiah before his birth, a pagan ruler who would be called the Lord's anointed. Such details reveal that Persia's place in prophecy was never incidental. The blood of Japheth through Madai coursed into the veins of an empire designed to test and to fulfill. The significance of this is profound, for it means that the conflict we now witness between Israel and Iran is not simply between two modern states, but between two legacies that trace back to the sons who stepped out of the ark. Shem's line carried the covenant. Ishmael and Isaac divided the blessing and promise. But Japheth's line through Madai birthed the empire of Persia, which still casts its shadow in modern Iran. The stage is thus set with three ancient streams converging in our time: Israel, the bearer of covenant; the Arab nations, the sons of Ishmael; and Iran, the heir of Madai. These are not random actors on the stage of history. They are the continuation of a divine script that began in the days of Noah. When you understand this lineage, you realize that the conflicts of today are echoes of ancient genealogies, and the names spoken in Genesis are the very forces that shape geopolitics. Now, the significance of Iran cannot be measured by its politics alone. It must be seen in the light of its ancient root, for the same soil that nurtured the empire which freed Israel under Cyrus later birthed decrees of destruction under Haman. and today fuels ambitions of dominance in the Middle East, history does not wander aimlessly. It circles back to fulfill what was written. Thus the name of Madai, though brief, has never been forgotten in the heavens. For from it grew Persia, and from Persia Iran, and in that lineage lies a role both fearsome and foretold. Three streams now flow through the landscape of history: the line of Isaac, the line of Ishmael, and the line of Madai that became Persia, each carrying within it a destiny that cannot be erased. When Abraham looked upon his two sons, he could not see the fullness of what would come. Yet the covenant and the blessing were already diverging. Isaac carried the promise, a covenant that would form the heart of Israel, a people set apart to bear the law, the prophets, and eventually the Messiah. Ishmael carried the blessing of multitude, his descendants forming tribes that stretched across deserts and mountains, fierce in survival, resilient in spirit, a people who would later give rise to nations identified with the Arab world. And then there was the quieter current, the line of Japheth through Madai, which would merge into Persia, an empire destined to dominate the ancient stage and to echo into modern Iran. These three lines are not mere genealogies. They are living forces, like rivers running beneath the surface of human affairs, converging in moments of conflict and prophecy. When viewed only through politics, one might see a clash of interests, borders, and resources, but when seen through the records of the Spirit, one perceives a deeper orchestration, a pattern that stretches from the tents of Abraham and the sons of Noah into the very headlines of today. Israel is more than a nation. It is the embodiment of covenant, chosen to bear light, law, and prophecy into the world. The Arab peoples are more than tribes. They are the living testimony of God's promise to bless Ishmael, to make him fruitful and great, to give him strength and endurance. Persia is more than an empire. It is the unfolding of Japheth's line into a force that would both challenge and serve divine purposes, at times crushing Israel's enemies and at times harboring plots of destruction against her. Together, these three streams form the backbone of Middle Eastern history. But more than that, they form the spiritual framework within which prophecy continues to unfold. Do you not see how each line carries its own role? Israel as the covenant bearer, Ishmael's children as the blessed multitude, and Persia as the third force that rises from the flood's aftermath. The convergence of these three was not random. It was alignment. Each line was prepared for its place in the unfolding drama of redemption and resistance. In the visions I have seen, they appear as three flames burning in different directions, yet drawn inevitably toward one another. The first flame burns with the light of promise, the second with the heat of multitude and survival, the third with the iron of empire and the mystery of prophecy. Their collision is not only inevitable, it is essential to the fulfillment of what has been spoken. History bears witness. For every century, the tension between these lines has reemerged, sometimes in open war, sometimes in hidden maneuvering, but always pressing toward the divine script. The battle is not only over territory, it is over identity, covenant, and purpose. Israel cannot deny its calling. The Arab world cannot deny its multitude. Persia cannot escape its prophetic shadow. These roles were inscribed long before any king rose to a throne or any general led an army. The names in Genesis are still alive in the earth, and their descendants still act out what was written. When you see Israel surrounded, when you hear the rhetoric of annihilation, when you watch alliances form across deserts and seas, you are watching the collision of three ancient streams. The covenant confronts the multitude, and both face the empire that grew from Japheth's son. This is not simply a triangular conflict of politics. It is a trifold drama of prophecy. The rivers of Isaac, Ishmael, and Madai continue to carry their currents into the ocean of history. And now, in our generation, we see them meeting again in the center of the Middle East. The stage is not set by men. It is set by the invisible hand that declared the end from the beginning. To understand these three forces is to understand that what unfolds is not chaos but design, not coincidence but covenant, not random rivalry but prophecy moving toward its fulfillment. I look into the stream of time and I see Jerusalem lying in ruins, the walls broken, the temple desecrated, the people dragged into exile by the Babylonians, their songs silenced, and their hope nearly extinguished. To them, it must have felt as if the covenant itself had been shattered, as if the promises given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been lost in the fire of conquest. Yet in the records of the Spirit, I see another layer. For long before Babylon carried them away, the prophet Jeremiah had spoken with sorrow and assurance that after 70 years of captivity, the people would return. How could such a promise survive when the mightiest empire of the age held them in chains, when their holy city was nothing but ash? The answer was already written in the scrolls of prophecy, and it would come through a most unexpected vessel, Persia. From the line of Japheth through Madai rose a man named Cyrus, a king of the Medo-Persian realm, a man who did not know the covenant, who had never bowed before the God of Israel, who held no Torah and no priesthood, yet whose name was inscribed in prophecy 150 years before his birth. In the book of Isaiah, I read, "This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue nations before him." The Lord called a pagan ruler his anointed, and in this I see the mystery of divine sovereignty, that God is not bound by borders or by bloodlines, that he can raise up whomever he wills to fulfill his purposes. As Cyrus marched through the ancient world, conquering kingdoms, he also carried within him a destiny he could not see. For when he overthrew Babylon, instead of tightening the chains on Israel, he broke them, and instead of erasing their memory, he restored it. By decree recorded in the opening of Ezra, he commanded that the exiles be released, that they return to Jerusalem, that they rebuild the house of the Lord. I hear in vision the hammers striking stone again, the laughter of families walking back through ruined gates, the songs of worship echoing once more in the land of promise. This act was not the whim of a benevolent ruler. It was the hand of God moving through the heart of a foreign king. In the chronicles of heaven, Persia became a vessel of mercy. The very empire that had risen from Japheth's son, the very power that prophecy had described as iron and silver, was used as an instrument to fulfill a word spoken through Jeremiah. Can you see the depth of this mystery? That God can use even those outside the covenant to preserve the covenant? As I behold this scene, I understand that no power on earth can resist the intention of the eternal. The Jews returned, the temple was raised again, and the covenant people walked once more in their land because a Persian king obeyed a divine impulse he did not even understand. In this lies a truth that still breathes today, that history is not shaped only by the faithful, but also by those who do not even know they are being guided. Cyrus carried the title of king, but heaven gave him the title of anointed. This is why I tell you, Persia was never outside the script. It was always part of the pattern, sometimes as an adversary, sometimes as an ally, always as a participant in prophecy. The exile ended not by the sword of Israel, but by the decree of a foreign ruler chosen for that moment. When I reflect upon this, I see clearly that God is never without instruments, that even in the darkest exile, he prepares deliverance. Often from the place no one expects, Persia stood as a paradox. The empire of conquest turned into the agent of restoration. This is the design that no man can undo, that the Eternal One weaves all things for the fulfillment of his word. And in the ruins of Zion, the people learnt again that no empire, however vast, can silence the covenant forever. Within the very empire that once opened the gates of restoration, another story emerged, one filled not with liberation, but with peril. For in the Persian court under King Xerxes, the destiny of the covenant people hung by a thread. I see in vision the opulence of the palace, marble pillars rising high, golden vessels gleaming under torchlight, courtyards echoing with feasts and decrees, and behind those walls a shadow took form in the heart of a man named Haman. His ambition was not simply political power, it was annihilation. Hatred burned within him with a fire colder than steel, and his desire was nothing less than the erasure of every Jew scattered across the empire. Consider the weight of this moment. The same soil that once carried the decree of Cyrus to rebuild Jerusalem now carried the plot to destroy Israel entirely. History within one land turned from mercy to menace, from restoration to threat. Haman's scheme was calculated, clothed in the garments of royal favor, sealed with the king's authority, but behind it pulsed an ancient enmity. The spirit that had long sought to crush the covenant line. Yet within this darkness, God had already placed an answer. Hidden in plain sight, a young Jewish woman named Esther, taken from obscurity and raised to the throne. She did not enter the palace with armies or with influence. She entered as a silent vessel, an orphan carried by providence into the heart of power. The contrast is striking. Haman cloaked in titles and rage, Esther clothed in humility and faith. Yet it would be her courage that turned the tide of nations. When the decree of destruction was written, the covenant people stood on the edge of extinction, and the fate of generations yet unborn trembled in the balance. Mordecai, her guardian, spoke words that still echo. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? In those words lies the recognition that destiny often hides in the ordinary, that divine appointment can lift the unnoticed into positions of decisive influence. Esther risked her life to approach the throne, for to enter the king's presence, unbidden, was to invite death. Yet she stepped forward carrying not only her own life, but the life of her people. Her petition exposed Haman's plot, and the gallows he prepared for Mordecai became his own undoing. The Jews were delivered, the covenant preserved, and Persia once more became the stage upon which salvation was revealed. Still, the lesson is sobering, for the same empire that freed the exiles also nearly destroyed them. The same soil that carried redemption also carried hatred. This is the mystery of Persia's role, sometimes instrument of deliverance, sometimes host of destruction, yet always part of the unfolding drama. The shadow of Haman did not vanish with his fall. It remained as a lingering spirit, a whisper of annihilation that would rise again in other rulers and other ages. In the records of the Spirit, I perceive that this pattern is not merely political. It is spiritual, the recurring attempt of darkness to cut off the covenant line, countered each time by divine intervention. Esther's courage stands as testimony that even when destruction seems certain, the Eternal One has already prepared a way through often hidden, often unlikely, but always sufficient. The banquet tables of Persia remind us that power shifts with a word, and that what men intend for evil can be overturned by the unseen hand guiding history. Thus, the story of Esther and Haman is not just an episode in ancient history. It is a revelation of the constant battle between covenant and opposition, between promise and hatred. It teaches that deliverance often comes through vessels who seem weak, and that annihilation is never as close as darkness believes, for the covenant cannot be broken. In the Persian palace, amid luxury and intrigue, prophecy moved again, showing that no empire, no official, no decree can silence the purposes of God. when the appointed hour of deliverance arrives. I saw the year 1979 unfold like a page turning in the records of time, and the land once called Persia rose again with a new face. Not as the empire of Cyrus, who released captives, nor as the court of Esther, where hidden deliverance was found, but as a nation consumed by revolution. The Shah was toppled, the streets filled with fire and chants, and a new regime seized power. This was not merely political change. It was a shift in spiritual atmosphere, for what emerged was a theocracy that clothed itself not only in authority, but in an apocalyptic vision. In the visions given to me, I felt the heaviness descend. The same soil that once carried decrees of restoration now carried vows of annihilation. The rulers of this new Iran declared from the beginning their enmity toward Israel, branding her the little Satan, not with passing rhetoric, but with words soaked in ancient contempt. Their constitution denied Israel's right to exist, not to negotiate, not to coexist, but even to exist. This was the spirit of Haman clothed in modern garments, rising from the shadows of history to speak again through microphones and manifestos. From that moment, Iran began to pour its resources into proxy wars, funding militias, arming factions, fueling hatred across borders. Hezbollah, Hamas, and other groups became vessels of this mission, striking at Israel not with open armies but with veiled hands. Yet the intention was clear: the eradication of the covenant people. In this I recognize the same darkness that Daniel perceived when the angel spoke of the prince of Persia resisting him, a principality that seeks always to oppose God's purposes through the land it inhabits. The revolution of 1979 was more than political upheaval. It was the reawakening of that principality, an ancient power stirring beneath the surface of a modern nation. Leaders rose, proclaiming the destruction of Israel as divine duty, and crowds answered with fervor, not realizing that they were voicing the same enmity that had echoed through centuries. Nations of the world called it ideology or geopolitics. But in the records of the Spirit, I saw it as something older, a shadow stretching from Haman's gallows into the present, a continuity of hatred that has never died, but only changed its mask. The weapons were new, missiles and nuclear ambitions, but the spirit was ancient, the same desire to erase covenant, to silence promise, to uproot prophecy. In the decades that followed, this atmosphere grew heavier. Alliances formed around Iran, tension deepened, and the Middle East became once more the crucible of prophecy. Each declaration from Tehran, each act of defiance, carried not only political weight but spiritual resonance, like tremors from an ancient fault line. The war of today is not new. It is the continuation of a fracture that began in Abraham's household, that flared in Esther's palace, that stirred in Daniel's vision. I have seen how the world often misreads such events, interpreting them as accidents of policy or expressions of ideology, but in truth they are echoes of the eternal struggle, the covenant confronting the opposition. Iran of 1979 became a vessel not merely of national ambition, but of spiritual defiance, declaring openly what the powers of darkness have long whispered, that Israel must be erased. And yet in this darkness I also discern the hidden design, for just as Cyrus was raised to deliver when none expected, and Esther was placed to intercede when death loomed, so too the Eternal One has not abandoned his covenant people. Even as the soil trembles under threats and hatred, there is preparation unseen. There is orchestration beyond the reach of politics. The revolution marked a new chapter, yes, but not the final word. In the unseen realm, the same hand that inscribed the name of Cyrus in Isaiah and placed Esther in a foreign palace continues to write, What seems like a rising tide of destruction is only another page in the prophecy that leads toward fulfillment. The spirit that rose in 1979 is strong, but it is not eternal, for above it stands the covenant that cannot be broken. In the visions of Daniel, I see a man fasting in sackcloth for 21 days, his face pale, his body weakened, his spirit desperate for understanding. He had prayed for clarity concerning his people, and for 3 weeks the heavens were silent. To the eyes of men, it seemed as if God had turned away, yet in the realm unseen, a different struggle was unfolding. An angel finally appeared, radiant and trembling with urgency, and he spoke words that pulled back the veil of history. From the first day you set your heart to seek understanding, your words were heard, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia resisted me for 21 days. Here is a revelation rarely grasped, that behind the thrones of kings and the decrees of rulers stand powers not of flesh and blood, but of spirit, intelligences dark and ancient, that bend the course of nations. The prince of Persia mentioned was not Cyrus or Darius. It was a principality, a spiritual ruler over the land, strong enough to delay a messenger of heaven until Michael himself came to assist. This truth shakes the illusions of human sovereignty. The real war is not waged with swords, nor decided by treaties. It is contested in the invisible realms, where angels and principalities clash. Persia, the empire that Daniel lived under, was governed not only by its kings, but by a spirit enthroned in its atmosphere, directing its movements, shaping its policies, fueling its conflicts. I see in the records that this same shadow has never fully vanished. Powers change hands, governments fall and rise, but the principality behind Persia lingers, changing masks, but not its essence. In the days of Daniel, it resisted heavenly messengers. In the days of Esther, it whispered through Haman. In the days of exile, it shadowed the decrees of kings. And in our time, it still breathes through the voices that call for annihilation, through the policies crafted in hatred, through the ambitions of modern Iran. When Paul wrote to the Ephesians, he unveiled this reality. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against rulers of darkness and spiritual wickedness in high places. This was not poetry. It was truth. Daniel's vision proved it. The prince of Persia is not an isolated figure. It is an example of the structures of unseen dominion that influence entire nations. What men interpret as politics often conceals the maneuvers of these powers. What appears as ideology is often the echo of a voice older than empires. And what seems like coincidence is the outworking of an invisible conflict pressing against the purposes of God. I have seen how this struggle weaves itself into the timeline of Israel and her adversaries. When you watch armies mobilize, when you hear speeches of hatred, you are not merely hearing men, you are hearing the resonance of ancient spirits contending for dominion. Iran's unrelenting hostility cannot be understood only by examining history or economics, for beneath it lies the same principality, the one Daniel's angel wrestled with, a ruler of darkness assigned long ago. That is why the conflict feels unending, why it resists every negotiation, why it re-emerges generation after generation. The spirit that once delayed an angel is still at work, delaying peace, foiling hostility, seeking to break covenant. Yet even in this, the outcome is never in doubt. The angel who spoke to Daniel revealed that though the prince of Persia resisted, the word of God was not silenced. Delay is not defeat. Opposition is not victory. The purposes of heaven advance even when resisted, for Michael stands with the messengers, and the Eternal One never abandons his covenant. As I read these visions, I know that what unfolds in our world is more than politics. It is prophecy, and the battlefield is larger than maps can show. It stretches from earth into the heavens. from the voices of rulers into the councils of spirits, the war is invisible, yet it is real, and its outcome is already declared. The prince of Persia may resist, but it cannot prevail, for the covenant remains, and the promise endures. In the visions of Ezekiel, there unfolds a storm rising from the edges of time, a prophecy that paints not vague symbols, but clear and chilling lines. In the 38th chapter, he describes a vast confederation of nations converging upon a small land, Israel, the covenant people, surrounded by overwhelming force. At the heart of this alliance stands Persia, the land we know today as Iran, joined with Kush and Put, nations from the regions of Africa, and accompanied by forces from the far north, Gog of the land of Magog, a leader whose identity has stirred debate for generations. Some see in Gog the shadow of northern empires near the steppes of Central Asia. Others connect the figure to the vast territories of modern Russia. Still, others discern in him the archetype of a final adversary who gathers hostile nations into one body of destruction. Regardless of interpretation, the essence is the same. Diverse nations, different in language and culture, drawn together by a singular aim to strike against Israel and erase the covenant from the earth. And the spirit, I see this alliance not as random geopolitics, but as a convergence ordained in prophecy. Threads from ancient genealogies pulled together into a single knot of opposition. Ezekiel's words speak of armies advancing like a storm, covering the land like a cloud, an image of overwhelming force meant to terrify and to break. Yet beneath their unity lies a darker power, the orchestration of the unseen, the same principality that resisted Daniel, now weaving alliances across continents. When we look at modern headlines, we see partnerships forming, nations aligning, treaties signed with quiet signatures and loud declarations. But through the lens of prophecy, we perceive something more, the slow but steady fulfillment of Ezekiel's vision, the rise of Persia, the presence of African nations, the shadow of northern powers. All of these are not mere accidents of politics. They are echoes of a script written millennia ago. Consider how unlikely it seems for nations so diverse to unite, for regions with little common ground to gather under one cause. Yet prophecy declared it, and history bends toward its word. The purpose of this alliance is not wealth, not territory, not survival, but the destruction of Israel, and through that act, a rebellion against the covenant itself. For to attack Israel is to defy the God who called her, to oppose the promise that has endured since Abraham. I see in this convergence a final attempt of darkness to overwhelm light, to gather all hostility into one last storm. The armies march not only with weapons, but with the weight of ancient hatred, a hatred that has echoed since Ishmael and Isaac, since Haman and Esther, since the prince of Persia resisted the angel. Now, in the vision of Ezekiel, it returns in full force, clothed in nations, armed with modern weapons, driven by the same old spirit. Yet the prophecy does not end with Israel consumed. It ends with divine intervention. For as the armies gather and the clouds cover the land, the voice of the Eternal breaks forth, declaring judgment, shaking the earth, sending hail and fire and plague upon the invaders. The covenant people do not stand alone. The God who neither slumbers nor sleeps arises. And the world will know that this is not the work of men, but the hand of the Lord. The meaning is clear. The alliances of men, however vast, cannot overthrow the covenant. The nations may rage and plot in vain, but when they move against Israel, they move against the Eternal One. Ezekiel's vision is both warning and assurance. Warning that the storm will come, assurance that the storm will be broken. I tell you, what we see forming in our own day may well be the outlines of this ancient prophecy, and if so, we stand nearer than ever to its fulfillment. The names in the chapter may sound ancient, but their modern reflections stand before our eyes. Persia is Iran. Cush and Put lie in Africa. Gog and Magog hover in the north, and Israel remains the same small land marked by covenant. The stage is set, the actors gather, and prophecy moves toward its appointed hour. I see the storm of nations rising, and I see the trembling of the earth as prophecy presses toward its conclusion. But I also see that the end is not destruction, it is intervention. In the vision of Ezekiel, the armies gather, Persia among them, clouds of soldiers advancing with confidence, and yet in the heavens there is no panic, only certainty. The Eternal One speaks with thunder, and the elements themselves become his weapons, hailstones, fire, and plague descending not by human hand but by divine decree. The invaders fall, the mountains quake, and the world knows that this was not the outcome of human strategy. It was the hand of God. Then my sight is lifted to Zechariah, where the picture sharpens. Jerusalem besiegt, the nations encircling, the holy city pressed to the edge. And in that darkest hour, the Lord himself descends. His feet stand on the Mount of Olives, the very place from which Christ ascended. And the mountain splits as a sign that history has turned its final page. This is not a vision of negotiation or diplomacy. It is the revelation of sovereignty. The king returns not as a suffering servant, but as a warrior, clothed in majesty, riding, as Revelation declares, upon a white horse, his robe dipped in blood, his eyes blazing with fire, and on his thigh the name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. In that moment, the schemes of nations collapse, the coalitions dissolve, and every tongue is silenced before the one who reigns. I have read in the records of the Spirit how men tremble at war, but heaven does not tremble. Heaven waits. The raging of nations is noise to the earth, but to the eternal it is futility. For Psalm the 2nd of December layers that the one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at their rebellion and says, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. When I hold this vision within me, I understand that what seems fragile and threatened is in truth unshakable. For the covenant was never dependent upon armies or politics. It was always guarded by the one who made it. In the return of the king lies the final assurance that prophecy is not endless conflict, but ultimate victory. Every knee will bow, every eye will see, and no power of man or spirit will stand against him. This is the culmination, the weaving together of Abraham's promise, Ishmael's blessing, Persia's shadow, Daniel's unseen war, Ezekiel's storm, Zechariah's descent, Revelation's triumph. All threads pulled into one tapestry that reveals a single truth. God reigns and his covenant endures. As I sit with these visions, I feel the weight not of fear, but of clarity. For though the headlines scream and alliances shift, though the threats rise and fall, the throne of heaven has never moved. The true preparation is not in stockpiles or strategies, but in discernment, in prayer, in aligning with the purposes of God. Psalm 122 calls to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, not as ritual words, but as prophetic agreement with the heart of heaven. To pray is to participate in the unfolding, to declare that we stand with the covenant, to be watchmen who refuse to sleep while prophecy advances. This is the call I leave you with. Do not see yourself as a spectator in history, but as a participant in the eternal design. You may not carry armies or influence governments, but your prayers, your faith, your watchfulness are threads woven into the same tapestry. The end is written, the king is returning, and the covenant will be vindicated. In the silence of meditation, I hear the sound of approaching hoofbeats, faint but certain, and I know that the story that began under the stars of Abraham will end under the blazing glory of the returning Christ, and in that day fear will vanish. Striving will cease, and the earth will know what the Spirit has always known, that the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever.